Welcome to the fourth teleconference on teaching and learning about the Puerto Rican diaspora. My name is Virginia Sanchez Coral, Professor Emerita, Brooklyn College, and I'm delighted to see all of you wide awake and eager to participate in this conference. And so, Pedro Juan?
Okay, muy buenos días. Bienvenidos a Hunter College and Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños fourth video conference as part of Centro's initiative Teaching and Learning Puerto Rican Studies. Esta cuarta conferencia es una iniciativa para la enseñanza y aprendizaje de estudios puertorriqueños organizada por el Centro. Today's conference is also co-sponsored by the University of Puerto Rico, the Department of Latin American and Puerto Rican Studies at Lehman College, and the New York City of Technology, and it is the second part devoted to the poster series and focuses on 4 posters of the 8. My name is Pedro Juan Hernández. I am the senior archivist in the archives of the Puerto Rican Diaspora, Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños. La anfitriona for this conference will be Professor Emerita Virginia Sanchez Corror, author of the classic book about the Puerto Rican diaspora in New York, From Colonia to Community. Before turning this video conference to Virginia, let's welcome nuestros co-auspiciadores, our other colleagues and participants in the sequence that we will follow throughout this video conference. They are David Badillo from Lehman College. David?
Is there? Okay.
Professor José Sánchez Lugo from la Universidad de Puerto Rico, recinto de Río Piedras. Professor Sánchez Lugo. Where are you? And I think hosting is Amílcar Tirado, director asociado de la biblioteca del recinto de Río Piedras. And Ms. Edna Padillo, assistant to Yvonne Barreras, in charge of collaborative projects at City Tech College, CUNY in Brooklyn.
Yes, hi, how are you?
Hi, how are you? And here in Hunter College will be Professor Emerita Virginia Sanchez Corror. And also I want to announce that we will be live streaming online with participants from around the world. They will be interacting with us by posting questions or comments in the chat box below the live feed. And on the website, and Centro Staff will select questions at random. Let's talk a little bit about the format and make a couple of announcements before starting the video conference. There will be no intermission during our video conference. However, our friends watching via the internet will experience periodic commercials. Here live, we won't have any commercials. For this conference, there's a handout titled Centro Video Conference 4 Program that we distributed to the site moderators, which describes the format that we will be following today and the purpose and overview of this video conference. Professor Sanchez Corral will be introducing each one of the 4 posters, followed up by a video clip. Following each presentation, we will go into a Q&A where a host from each side will select questions from the audience. Finally, I want to welcome and turn the video conference to Emerita Professor Virginia Sanchez Corral. Virginia.
Thank you, Pedro Juan. I think actually we're going to do this together because Pedro Juan brings such a wealth of information to us about the archival collection, which is, of course, fundamental to the poster series. And so we will jointly share whatever responsibilities on this side of the table. And one of the things I would ask you to do is to, when you enter into the conversation, to please identify yourselves. Because we know some of you are our immediate colleagues, but some of our colleagues from other campuses are not as familiar to us. So we begin with the first poster. And the first poster is the Puerto Rican Heritage Poster Series. It's actually the posters that we're going to be sharing today are the final 4 of a series that we have already discussed in earlier teleconferences. And this one is very, very exciting because it has two maps for us to look at, and you will be seeing videos about them as we go along. The first one, the Diasporas in History of the Puerto Rican People, Part 1, explains to us that the Taíno, Spanish, and African roots of Puerto Rico from about 2000 BC to 1898. And I believe we have a video on that. Welcome to the Puerto Rican Heritage Poster Series. Today we are introducing the 4 new posters. The first one indicates the diasporas in the history of the Puerto Rican people, and the years are basically 2000 BC to 1898. Looking at the map, if we begin with the Taíno or the Arawak roots of Puerto Ricans, we can trace that easily on the map. The first lines that we see are coming from Venezuela, coming from the southern part of the United States into Puerto Rico, almost 200 years before Columbus ever set foot on the islands. This migration of indigenous peoples, we know, begins very, very, very early, thousands and thousands of years before, as they cross the Bering Strait from Asia and come down what is today Canada and what is today the United States, through Central America, through Mexico, and into South America. And it is from these very, very early roots that the indigenous people begin to populate the islands, because there are more than one of Puerto Rico. The second line that is of interest, of course, has to do with the Spanish heritage. Well, how is it that these people from here got to Puerto Rico all the way over here? The line in the middle tells us that this was the voyage of Columbus in November of 1493. It was the one voyage out of 4 that actually landed in Puerto Rico. And we see that it originates somewhere in the Iberian Peninsula. And actually, he had gone from Spain to the islands off the coast of Portugal before he actually began the voyage across the seas to Puerto Rico. The next line, of course, has to do with the African roots of Puerto Ricans. And we notice that from the coast of West Africa, numerous lines begin to emerge and go towards the islands of Puerto Rico. Well, beginning as early as the 1500s up until 1873, when slavery was abolished in Puerto Rico, there was both a very, very active trade in enslaved people from the west coasts of Africa to Puerto Rico and the other islands of the Caribbean, as well as the southern part of the United States and Latin America. And so we can begin to trace those stories by allowing our students to see how these voyages converged into Puerto Rico. In 1815, the period 1815 to about the 1890s, there is a very, very large immigration from Europe into Puerto Rico. One of the reasons for that immigration is that in 1815, the crown, the Spanish monarchy, offers a cédula de gracias. It was a decree to encourage immigration into the islands of both Cuba and Puerto Rico and other parts of the other colonies of the crown. And what they wanted to do was to populate the islands so that people would come and develop the island's agricultural sector in such a way that it would be productive for the crown, because Spain, of course, was the metropolis. Spain was the colonial power of Cuba and Puerto Rico. The one stipulation was that immigrants to Puerto Rico had to be Catholic. and that they had to swear loyalty to the crown of Spain, which they do. And as a result, we have immigrants from the Canary Islands, immigrants from Corsica, immigrants from Germany, immigrants from Italy, from France, from Great Britain, particularly Ireland, because Ireland, of course, was a Catholic country. Another point that's really interesting in this map takes place from about the 1860s to 1898, which brings us to the end of this segment, and that is an immigration from Puerto Rico to the United States, different parts of the United States, beginning with New Orleans, places like New York, Philadelphia, Boston. Puerto Ricans are leaving Puerto Rico for two reasons. One of them is that they're being exiled for their political beliefs, and the second is that they are leaving the island because of the oppression of the colonial government. And so beginning in the 1860s, in 1868, you have El Grito de Lares, which was a political movement to try to bring independence to Puerto Rico, an independence that should have been gotten much earlier in the century when the Latin American countries got theirs. But Puerto Rico, being a fortress and being a military outpost, was not so easily made independent. The exiles come to New York, and from New York and Philadelphia and Boston, they begin to plan with the Cuban compatriots the independence movement that would culminate in 1898, not the way that they thought, by liberating the two countries, but rather because of the Spanish-Cuban-American War. So this poster, which ends in 1898, gives us a very, very nice example of people who come to Puerto Rico, people who leave Puerto Rico over a period of a few centuries. The next poster does something that is completely different.
Hola, ahora let's hear some of the questions. Let's start with Lehman College, Professor David Badillo. Any questions?
Sure. Does anybody here want to offer anything? Yes, could you speak up, please?
Yes, I have a question. My name is Janice Mata. I'm from the English Department, Lehman College, formerly of the Department of Puerto Rican Studies. My question is about the migration of the various European countries to Puerto Rico. You mentioned Ireland and Portugal, and various countries, Italy, Germany. Who were the people who came? I understand that they were Catholic countries and Catholics were inside, but who were the people? Did they come voluntarily, or were they? Did they have incentives, monetary or other? And what was the reason for their migration for the most part?
You want me to take that? Well, there were a number of reasons for people wanting to leave these countries. Of course, one, as I mentioned, was the oppression, the religious oppression in Ireland. But the Crown offered enormous incentives. And the incentives had to do with land, acreage for per family, and acreage for any slaves that you would bring as part of your workforce. Not that the slaves were getting the land, but the incoming immigrant and his family would be accumulating land according to the numbers of people that they were bringing. But the other thing was that they offered livestock, seeds, agricultural implements, anything that they needed in order to make the land productive. Now, they had a certain number of years in which to do this, and some succeeded and some did not. But some of the largest hacendados come as a result of these land grants, these cédulas. The 1815 was not the only one. There had been others before. David, you could probably add to that. There had been others before, but the 1815 was very, very significant because it took place about a few years before the Latin American colonies got their independence. And it meant that Spain was seriously looking at the productive development of the islands instead of just looking at the military strategic possibilities of the island. And we know, of course, that after the wars of independence, Spain is left with Cuba and Puerto Rico, and they strive to make those two islands as productive as they possibly could to make up for the loss of revenues and taxes that they ordinarily would have gotten from the other colonies. So these people are people who have some means, have skills, have a vision that they're going to have a better life by immigrating, not unlike the immigrants that come from Puerto Rico to the United States in later centuries. And some of the biggest hacendados were German, Italian, of other nationalities, and curiously, that's why you find in Puerto Rico the diversity of surnames coming from all different parts of the world. And you say, well, wait a minute, how did these French names get into Puerto Rico? How does a Schomburg happen? For example, how do you get these names? Well, that's part of this massive inducement to come to the islands. Anyone else want to comment on this? You don't only have to ask questions, you know. It would be great if you could really comment on, for example, how do you see yourself using these new materials? Yeah.
Well, Virginia, a lot of our students are very curious about the diversity of the other groups, the people from Africa and the people from the indigenous people. Is there, and then sometimes the information isn't as available. How would you suggest that we balanced all these different European, indigenous, and African origins in a way that students can absorb it?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about the maps is the visual effects. I think that what it offers, and I'm not quite sure that I'm getting directly at your comment, but one of the things that it offers, as you see the maps on the screen, is that you begin to ask questions. Why are there so many lines coming out of Africa and almost the same number of lines coming out of Europe? Well, you know, that brings you into a discussion of slavery, of the workforce that the hacendados would need in order to make the land productive. And you begin to see these correlations because of the layout of the maps that you can, that ordinarily is lost in a textbook. But you can also go to the Centro website for other resources on this. There is a question that came in about the Bering Strait. Was it only over the Bering Strait? As far as we know, there were migrations coming out of Venezuela and the southern part of the United States and the Yucatan Peninsula coming into the islands of the Caribbean. But those were more recent. The earliest migrations are still believed to be those that came 70, 80,000 years ago over the Bering Straits and then begin to populate the continent in ways that we know. Interestingly enough, we don't have enough recorded history for that early period, but we do begin to get recorded history for the Caribbean once we begin to make these movements from South America upwards and from the United States, from what is today the United States downward, and so on. So, anyone else? Rio Piedras? New York Tech?
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Then we will take the questions from here from Hunter. ¿Preguntas, Rio Piedras? No. Here we have a question. What countries in Africa were the main places of movement of enslaved Africans? What nations or people, for example, Yoruba, etc.? So, la pregunta es sobre qué áreas de África se dio el tráfico negrero, de esclavismo. Si podemos comentar sobre
Y
eso.
eso se puede comentar, se puede ver muy claramente en los mapas porque viene de Senegal, de Sierra Leone, Nigeria, el Congo y Angola. Eso es lo que tenemos en el mapa. Lo importante es que es la costa oeste que va a traer diferentes tradiciones y la cultura de esos sitios.
Tengo una pregunta, Virginia, a ver si podrías comentar un poco. Esto obviamente es un proyecto donde muchas personas intervinieron, pero si quisiéramos saber si puedes mencionar alguna de las personas que han trabajado creando este tipo de afiches y carteles que estamos presentando en el día de hoy.
Bueno, we have to definitely credit Edna Acosta Belén, who couldn't be with us today, because she was the one who actually came up with the design, and the staff at Centro worked with her in pulling these posters together. Carlos Fraticelli también trabajó con los mapas y bueno, varias gente a number of people en el centro. Yeah.
Okay. So, can we...
I think we should move on. The second map, which I remember saying,
Mention this.
the second map in the diasporas in the history of the Puerto Rican people is labeled Puerto Rican migrations to the United States and the Caribbean, and the time period is 1898 to 2012. I want to mention that there are some other comments and questions coming in, and we will try to fit them in as we go along, because there will be periods when no one is commenting, and we can certainly deal with it at that point. So that the second map takes into account first of all, the colonization of Puerto Rico vis-a-vis the United States, the migration of Puerto Ricans in the early part of the 20th century, the early migrations, the Great Migration. We go on to looking at the migrations of contemporary times, like the Cubans coming to Puerto Rico and the Dominicans coming into Puerto Rico as well. And then particularly interesting is the Puerto Rican geographic dispersion, which takes place from the 1970s to 2010s. So let's roll. In 1898, as a result of the Spanish-Cuban-American War, Puerto Rico was ceded to the United States. Now that it is part of the United States, it comes within the United States political and economic orbits. And one of the first migrations that we see is that of American businessmen, missionaries, teachers, government administrators, all American, the American structure of administration moving from the United States into Puerto Rico. Because Puerto Rico is part of the United States, it now becomes part of a workforce, a movable workforce, that under the auspices of the American government, it can be encouraged to move to different parts of the hemisphere. So, for example, one of the earliest migrations of Puerto Ricans are the contingents of workers that are brought from Puerto Rico into the islands of the Hawaiian Islands. Now, why is that? It's the other side of the world, practically. But here we are in the Hawaiian Islands, which are acquired by the United States in 1898. Now, the Hawaiian Islands are also sugar producers of tropical fruits, very, very similar in agricultural nature to Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rican workers are encouraged to leave the island and go to Hawaii. And in 1917, something very significant happens, and that is the Jones Act confers American citizenship onto Puerto Ricans. It enables a larger immigration from Puerto Rico to the United States because as American citizens, they are not foreigners, they're not aliens, they are citizens and they're crossing borders of their own country. So by 1917, we see that in New York City, we have a very, very active, thriving community, and New York begins to emerge as the most visible, most important of the Puerto Rican communities that would be formed during this time. By the mid-1940s, what we have is, and we see it in red, and we see a number of arrows going to different places, is the beginnings of a large migration from Puerto Rico to the United States. We refer to that as the Great Migration because thousands upon thousands of Puerto Ricans left the islands in order to come to work in cities like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Hartford, Dover, New Jersey, Lorain, Ohio. A number and workers are actively recruited to come from Puerto Rico to fill industrial jobs and actually to come into the United States for a period in which the economy is booming. After the Second World War in particular, when the economy is booming, this enormous immigration from Puerto Rico comes to work on. But we see that the immigration from Puerto Rico had a number of different strands. The green, in particular, shows us that Puerto Ricans leaving the island, also for economic reasons, now no longer for as political as it was in the last century, but leaving the island for economic reasons, begin to go from Puerto Rico directly to other places outside of New York, so that by the time we get into the 1970s, the Migration Division, which is connected with the Department of Labor in Puerto Rico, begins to actively recruit Puerto Ricans to other places other than New York. The population in New York had almost reached 1 million Puerto Ricans by the beginning of the 1960s, and there were other places where jobs were plentiful and where a labor force was needed. And so we begin to see that people are going directly to Boston from Puerto Rico. They're going directly to Hartford, Connecticut. They're going to California. They're going to Florida. And by the 1970s up until the 2010, we see that there has been a dispersal of the Puerto Rican population throughout the United States that now indicates that Puerto Ricans are living in every state of the Union, in Hawaii, in Alaska, and that the numbers of Puerto Ricans in New York City, while it has declined, is still very, very significant. In studying the diaspora of Puerto Ricans, using the two maps that we've just shown, it allows us to see the span of history over a very long time and what happens in one place throughout those centuries.
I would like to make a comment that many of the resources that we have seen throughout the video clips are resources from the Central Library and Archives, of many resources that are available in Centro, and the people can access some of those resources and the Centro website, that is centropr.hunter.cuny.edu. Before we go also to let's go first to Lehman College. David Badillo y los compañeros. Do you have questions or comments, please?
Please identify yourself.
Hello out there. This is Andres Torres. How's everyone doing? A comment, hi Ricardo. A comment on the context of reception of the big migration right after World War II into New York City. I've been just revisiting a lot of the original studies that were done by New York City officials in the late 40s and the 50s. And what's striking, I know this is not new to many of us, but it seemed to me worth resuscitating this idea of the disconnect between officialdom in New York City and the government in Puerto Rico, their planning and the recruitment efforts and so forth, were totally in disregard of the capacity of the city of New York to receive such a large number of new immigrants at that scale. And it again, I think, helps us to understand the unplanned and chaotic beginnings of the Puerto Rican migration from the very, the main Great Migration, and that unplanned character must have something to do with the long-term unsettled nature of our community. We were essentially dropped into a place which wasn't ready for us, which had its own ongoing debates and controversies around its own population size, its aging housing stock, the lack of any master plan for where New York City was going after World War II. The Puerto Rican Great Migration is just an afterthought to all the big players that were behind all of this occurring. And I would argue that that's a theme that we might want to think about once again revisiting as we teach and return to the beginnings of the Puerto Rican community after World War II in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you.
New York Tech?
Lehman College. Universidad de Puerto Rico, profesor Sánchez Lugo y compañeros, ¿preguntas o comentarios
Sí, hay preguntas.
Sí. I want to congratulate you.
Identifica.
I'm Nancy Abreu from Sistema Bibliotecas Puerto Rican Collection, and I want to congratulate you for this poster series. They are a great work of synthesis of a very complex historic phenomena. And my question is, do you have made a publication that presents all the amount of primary and secondary sources that you have used for this poster series so the student can have a guide for further reading?
Yes, I think, Luis, do you want to take that?
I would say that part of the work that Centro is continuing, to do this year and into the next year is to take the information that is on the posters, the events, the individuals, and to put them into a database tied to our own archives and collections, so that, for example, the migration into Hawaii, that information would be incorporated into the timeline about the migration of Puerto Ricans in the United States, and links to primary and secondary sources that we may have from as we work looking at newspaper articles, journal articles, images that are in our collection, and this is ongoing work.
I want to comment that there is a question that has come to us that's really interesting and, in a sense, really will answer some of your, will partially answer what you're asking. And that is a question that came in from an outside viewer. And it says, and I'm throwing this out to everyone, why do mainly non-Puerto Ricans associate the eastern coast of the United States with the Puerto Rican image, despite the fact that in the calendar year 2012, we occupy just about every city and or town in the United States? And I think that's a fabulous question, and I would think that some of the work that Centro has been doing with the posters and the videos and the all of the information that is on the website, and I think that work is intended to begin to broaden the vision of the diasporas. These maps are called diasporas in the history. They're not called diaspora. It's not just a group of people coming to one place. It is many, many people, many groups of people moving to many different places. And why is it that that Puerto Ricans are only associated? It's very, very interesting. We have to do more in terms of how we teach our history, how we teach social studies, how we prepare teachers to teach, and how we utilize all the vast information and material that's available to us. There was an interesting article on page 1 that I'm sure many of you saw of the New York Times yesterday that said that what Latino students lack is an image of themselves in the books. And I almost threw the paper against the wall because I said to myself, isn't it interesting that we have vast amounts of material that we have been producing over the last 50 years, particularly to bring that image into the public consciousness. And now someone has decided that we don't have Latino images in the books. The work that Centro does ensures that the image is going to be in the books and is going to be available to the teachers. So thank you for your comments on the map, Rio Piedra.
Yeah, I would like to add that today we are focusing in 4 of the posters, but in the previous presentation we went into other posters that were created, and one of them precisely, and it was shown throughout the video clip, showed the dispersion on the Puerto Rican communities in the state side, and that's part of the series of 8 posters. And Centro is part of, this is one of many initiatives that we have been working together with all you guys. And one of the things that we are doing is posting resources in Centro website. For example, we have Vanessa and Virginia's open courseware that is available in our website. And also we are working on open courseware on education that is also available. And in some ways try to address some of these issues in terms of the Puerto Rican dispersion throughout the country, and it's a tool that is useful for all of us, regardless of where we are at this moment. And I don't know if there's another comment, but if it's not, we would like to. Sí, adelante, amigo.
Tengo una pregunta. Sí,
Adelante.
Quería preguntar o un comentario. Si ustedes han explorado en ese trabajo que están realizando, ¿por qué los migrantes puertorriqueños de principios del siglo XX van a Nueva York y no a lugares en el sur de los Estados Unidos?
Okay. Una de las cosas que queremos señalar es que esta serie de afiches o carteles lo que pretenden es estimular precisamente a lo que está sucediendo aquí, que es que hay una serie de interrogantes, muchas de ellas, muchos académicos, especialistas han publicado sobre esos temas y tienen respuesta. Otros todavía estamos en proceso de encontrar respuesta, y es precisamente este esfuerzo colaborativo el que nos va a ayudar a identificar esas preguntas y esas respuestas que hay que compartir.
Amilca, la verdad es que sí van al sur de los Estados Unidos. Sí, especialmente los migrantes que se contrataron para trabajar en agrícola. Y tenemos mucha información sobre, por ejemplo, 1917-18, cuando los barcos que salían de Puerto Rico con los inmigrantes bajo contrato, bueno, iban para South Carolina, iban para partes del sur. Muchos de ellos se quedaron en esos sitios. Igualmente cuando la migración a Hawái, que hay varios puntos en donde la gente se paraban esperando transportación o lo que sea. Y por eso es que tenemos una comunidad en San Francisco desde 1912, que ya se ve otra en New Orleans. Así es que no es que no lo hay, es que nosotros todavía estamos buscando las maneras de traer esta información a concientizar la gente.
Quería añadir un poco como respuesta a las preguntas y inquietudes en términos de las migraciones to other places in the States. And as we know, and there's resources that have been created. And for example, Centro many years ago published Sources of the Puerto Rican Migration, where they compiled part of the Puerto Rican migration to places like Hawaii and California. I think America was part of that collective group that put together those compilation of newspaper clippings and public documents that precisely document the Puerto Rican diaspora, all the places that we just had mentioned. And this, again, is a way to start that conversation. I would like if Virginia and some other people can comment in terms of the audiences that we are trying to reach out about with these posters and these resources. Virginia, would you like to comment, or perhaps Luis? What are the audiences that we are trying to reach out with these posters and resources that we are creating?
Our expectation is that librarians, researchers, people in universities would be one of the groups that would be interested in the material as a source of teaching and passing on information to others. For example, in undergraduate introductory courses on Puerto Ricans, people from the Caribe. Also, high school teachers working with upperclassmen who might be interested in doing projects and research, some of it dealing with issues of race, ethnicity, culture, and geographic dispersion being part of that. We also hope that teachers would be able to reach into the junior high schools, certainly as part of social studies and geography classes, and that this would be an element of interdisciplinary learning.
Okay. Now I would like to formally welcome Ms. Edna Padilla, Assistant to Yvonne Barreras, in charge of collaborative projects at City Tech College, CUNY in Brooklyn. They have been with us for a while, but now formally we are welcoming you, and we would like to take your comments or questions, please.
Hi, nice to meet you. At the moment, I don't have any questions or any comments. Thank you.
Okay. So now we
I think we move on.
Yeah, please.
Of course, the maps that we've been showing you are part of a series where today we're looking at 4 of them. And I think what's important to understand is that while the maps give us a quick overview of the diasporas, the details come to a certain degree in the other posters. And we have, for example, the next one on our list is the Brief Historical Chronology of Puerto Ricans in the United States, Part 4. And that includes references to the Puerto Rican movement and its outcomes, 1960s to 2010s. And the topics that are covered in this next poster are striving for equality and community empowerment, and political participation and public service. And what you're going to see is that part 5 in the poster series is related to part 4 in that it is also the Puerto Rican movement and its outcomes, but the focus will be on educational struggles. We'll get to that as we move along. So we are going to see a brief video on the poster number 4.
This poster provides a brief historical chronology of Puerto Ricans in the United States, the Puerto Rican movement and its outcomes. We will only highlight a few of them. As New York Puerto Rican barrios began to grow in the 1920s and 30s, issues of educational and citizenship rights, equal treatment, electoral participation, incorporation, and representation in the U.S. political system gradually came to the fore and gained more visibility in later decades. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by the U.S. Congress forbade discrimination and segregation on the basis of race, color, national origin, gender, and religion. The act represents an important legal, institutional, and symbolic milestone for the struggles carried out by several generations of primarily African Americans, but also Latinos, Native American, women, and other disenfranchised groups in the United States. The new civil rights legislation galvanized these populations into continuing their social and political battles and demands for equality and empowerment of their communities. In their demands, they often adopted the militant outlook that transformed society during the mid-1960s and 70s, including mass demonstrations for Puerto Rican civil rights. As a result of a police shooting of a Puerto Rican youth during the first Puerto Rican parade in the Division Street neighborhood of Chicago, the first Puerto Rican riot took place in the United States. These riots were the manifestations of an urban unrest that characterized many urban centers of the United States during the 1960s. And they were the result of pervasive racism and discrimination, the neglect by city governments of deteriorating ethnic neighborhoods, and of the urban renewal projects that essentially removed these populations from those urban centers. As a result, in the following years, riots took place in New York, in New Jersey, and in Philadelphia, Puerto Rican neighborhoods. The Chicago street gang, named the Young Lords, gains political awareness and becomes the Young Lords organization. The Young Lords engage youth and other segments of the community in denouncing civil rights abuses and the neglects of city governments of poor economic conditions in those neighborhoods. In years to come, they opened chapters in New York City, other cities of the Northeast, and in Puerto Rico. In 1981, the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights is founded in the South Bronx to advocate for human and civil rights of the Puerto Rican people and to fight against racism and discrimination. Urban renewal projects that effectively removed Puerto Ricans and other poor residents of their neighborhoods in the 1950s and 1960s resulted in resistance on the part of these communities. However, as these urban renewal projects extended to other cities, this resistance also extended itself. One example of this is the resistance against the New York City's gentrification process, as evidenced in the Lower East Side. Casitas, little wooden structures reminiscent of the rural and semi-urban houses throughout Puerto Rico, began to appear autonomously throughout lots in northern cities and cities in the Midwest in which Puerto Ricans lived. These casitas were in effect a response to the urban decay as well as the urban renewal process that removed many Puerto Ricans from their environments. They are in fact a grassroots effort at community control and changing environments throughout the United States. Some of the most noteworthy casitas are La Rincón Criollo, founded in the South Bronx in 1987, and La Casita de Don Pedro, founded in the Division Street neighborhood of Chicago in 1998. Herman Badilla becomes the first Puerto Rican congressman in the United States, elected to the House of Representatives in 1970 for the 21st District of the South Bronx. Prior to his election as U.S. Member of Congress, Congressman Badillo had been the Bronx Borough President, the first Puerto Rican to occupy that post in 1965. In 1992, two more Puerto Ricans are elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. They are Congresswoman Nidia Velázquez, who represents a district in New York City, and Congressman Luis Gutierrez, who represents a district in Illinois. They joined Congressman Jose Serrano, who had been elected to the House in 1990. In 2006, a fourth Puerto Rican is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, Raúl Labrador, the first Republican elected to the House to represent a district in Idaho. In 1981, Irma Vidal Santaella becomes the first Puerto Rican woman to occupy a seat in the Supreme Court of New York State. In the 1970s, she had been a founding member of the National Association for Puerto Rican Civil Rights, and she had also been a member of the Commission on the Status of Women in New York State. In 2009, President Barack Obama appoints federal judge Sonia Sotomayor to become the first Latina, the first Puerto Rican to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. This historical trajectory provides a glimpse of the adversity, the struggles, and the advances the Puerto Rican community in the United States has experienced over the decades. It demonstrates that advance and progress are possible for this community in the wake of the assertion of rights and struggles that lead to political empowerment.
So let's take questions to Center's researchers Carlos Vargas Ramos' introduction to the poster Puerto Rican Movement and its Outcome 1960-2010s. And let's start with our colleagues from Lehman College. Lehman, questions, comments?
Just an observation that this particular sequence seemed to have more visuals, and I was wondering how how you determine how much narrative versus the visuals and how the production component works, because this one seemed to have a lot more, for the eye, and I think students like that. So how does it work? How do you formulate the posters, develop them?
Are you asking how the decisions that were made in order to put the poster together, or are you asking how would it work in terms of teaching from the posters, or?
Well, yeah, we're both. I guess as instructors, we're trying to see how we would use the materials, and we've tried using snippets for various components, and sometimes it works better than others. So I guess it's all a work in progress. So I was just wondering how you thought that we could develop this best, so whether it's just with our comments or whether you have some ideas.
Yeah. Let's take let's take a comment from parents. They have comments, and then we'll get back to it.
Preguntas, compañeros de Río Piedras. Preguntas o comentarios.
Y puede ser en español.
Okay. I want to thank all of you for this great conference, video conference, and I want to tell you, my name is Iris Parrilla. I am la directora de la colección de las artes. And I have some resources that you haven't mentioned. Not only we have posters, and we have posters too, but we have a great collection of Christmas cards that can help, that are made by artists, great artists, Puerto Rican artists, that can help in the history of Puerto Rican that have moved to different places in the world. And for example, the problem that we have in the culture with this movement, when the Puerto Rican go with our culture to other places, and in the case of the United States, with the conflict with the Three Kings, the Christmas, and Santa Claus, and this kind of cards represent some issues in this comment that I'm making. And it's very interesting how this helps students to visual see what is happening to the artists when they motivate to make these cards and these resources they use. Other thing that you mentioned was that I saw was the hoja suelta, loose leaves that you show about some movement in the strides or in the video. And this, right, okay. Y esta es bien importante porque no solamente se estudia lo que hay en los posters desde el punto de vista histórico, sino que hay otros recursos que son también artísticos y que han motivado a utilizar esto, por ejemplo, estas hojas sueltas que él demostró, donde los artistas demuestran pues la queja que sea en relación a lo que está sucediendo. Y nosotros tenemos una buena colección sobre esto, y marcan fecha, por ejemplo, la huelga va y el movimiento o esto. Aquí hay un artista que diseñó lo que llamamos cartelera. Esto que es un póster y a la vez hoja suelta. Entonces él invitaba a diferentes artistas para que colaboraran y la cartelera tiene un tema. El tema podía haber sido alcoholismo, problemas en la colonia, la situación del SIDA a nivel mundial, etcétera, y política, cultural, social. Y entonces los artistas puertorriqueños responden. Y esa colección la tenemos completa, desde el primero, y marcan unos hechos históricos, en unos momentos históricos. A veces, pues lamentablemente, los estudiantes desconocen que estos recursos están ahí. Así que esta ha sido una gran oportunidad para que, por ejemplo, nosotros hemos tenido contacto con, vi por aquí, el Museo del Barrio, tenemos contacto con el Museo del Barrio y intercambiamos recursos. O sea, no solamente intercambiamos pósters, sino recursos también. Así que mi pregunta es, me encantaría tener contacto con ustedes para continuar esta labor y hacerlo en una forma, pues, vamos a ver, digitalmente.
Yeah, I would like to comment to what just had been said. This is this collaborative effort that we have been working on. There are several video conferences. Last video conference was showing some of the many resources that are available at the Universidad de Puerto Rico. And so all these video conferences are in our website, so people can go back and look at what happened in the first, the second, and the third, and today's last conference, and get a whole picture of what we are trying to put together. It's a collaborative effort among all of the participants, and that's why we're so pleased. And also address a little bit of the previous question, that this, right now we're just talking about the poster, but there are many other products that Centro is putting together. And not only Centro, but we are expecting that all the participants will be collaborating. And what we just want to let people know is that not only Centro, but the Universidad de Puerto Rico, Lehman College, and all the other participants have some resources to share, and there are places to go looking for these resources.
New York Tech, questions or comments?
Not at all.
No. Let me go back to David's question, because I think it's a very, very intriguing one for teaching. I know that when the posters were being put together, we had a lot more information that we wanted to add, and it was only the lack of space. As you can see, the posters are going to be much larger than this, but as you can see, there's a great deal of information, almost difficult to discern from a distance. All of the imagery comes from our archives, and some of it is our materials that you've never seen before. But so in terms of putting it together, we see this as one of many. This is not the definitive answer on historical chronology by any means. But what strikes me as interesting is of course, being a historian who focuses on women's history, is the fact that we begin to see and we begin to trace the political participation and growth of our community very, very easily through these strands as we go through the posters. I mean, we can go further back into posters 1, 2, 3, and do the same thing. But here is something very, very interesting. For a very long time, Irma Vidal Santaella has been an instrumental person in the Puerto Rican community, but we only know Sonia Sotomayor, with good reason and well deserved. In looking at the emergence of a Sonia Sotomayor, we can begin to see that there is a historical basis and that the struggles of the past have led us slowly to the creation of a Sonia Sotomayor. And Irma does not have a biography yet. Irma is unknown to the community. She actually was a Hunter College alumni, which is really important for Centro to follow up on. The Young Lords, for example, we're not only talking about the Young Lords in New York, which is, again, the imagery is always the Young Lords in New York, but its beginnings in Chicago, which we know, but we kind of don't bring it immediately to mind. The posters make you look at those little intricate links as you go from one to the other.
If I might add, please. This is Luis Reyes. We have a copy of a poster I'd like to bring over, Claricel, so that we can see it on the screen. A real size
poster.
A real size poster.
Yeah.
Give it to me.
Anyway, we expect the 8 posters. This poster that you see behind Pedro Juan is of the Puerto Rican movement and its outcomes, educational struggle, which is the next poster that we'll be showing. We expect to have the 8 posters ready for distribution and purchase by late January, early February. They can be made and distributed as a package rolled up, and they can also be available as this one is on hard material. I forget.
Poster board.
Poster board, thank you.
Yeah.
For example, at the recent Puerto Rican Studies Association conference in Albany, we were able to present and people see those posters. We hope that we'll be also able to get sponsors, foundations, or other organizations that can sponsor the printing and dissemination of these posters to teachers, so that or to schools, so that they do not have to pay for them themselves. But that's part of a fundraising process that we are undertaking in the new year.
If I may add,
Yes.
Pedro,
And
Pedro, ¿puedo hacer otro comentario?
Sí, adelante, Amílcar, por favor.
Sí, un comentario siguiendo la línea de Virginia sobre las mujeres, porque hay una persona muy interesante en las décadas de los 40 en adelante, o antes, que es Celia Vice, y de la cual muy poca gente la conoce. Yo tuve la oportunidad de entrevistarla y compartir con ella, y ella tiene tenía muchas historias sobre su participación. Ella me contaba a mí cómo ella pues alquilaba los apartamentos, porque no le rentaban los apartamentos a los puertorriqueños, y como ella era rubia, ojos claros, blanca, pues no tenía problema en que le alquilara los apartamentos, y ella los alquilaba entonces a los puertorriqueños. Ella es muy importante con la tradición de los 3 Reyes Magos, las paradas, la librería que ella tuvo por mucho tiempo en Nueva York.
Right.
En fin, me parece que es una persona a la cual sí se debe destacar.
Interesante también, Amílcar, que también tenemos la idea que la historia puertorriqueña es aquí en Nueva York, en Manhattan, y Celia viene de Brooklyn. Y la comunidad que no se ha estudiado al nivel que se debe de estudiar. Comentario quería hacer Edwin.
Dos cosas. Primero, que tenemos una campaña de los 100 puertorriqueños, 100 Puerto Ricans. Pueden ir a nuestro website y encontrar información, pero lo importante de esa campaña es que precisamente trata de recoger documentos, historias orales de esta población pionera, como la persona que tú mencionas, que todavía no tenemos información de ellos en nuestros archivos. Y este empuje comenzó hace el año pasado, o este año, al principio de este año, y estamos continuando al año que viene. Parte de lo que quería comentar con los posters es que esta semana que viene voy a Puerto Rico a hablar con algunos compañeros a ver cómo podemos promover exhibiciones de estos posters con materiales de guías de discusión. Los videos que tenemos a mano, tenemos 4 o 5 videos que podrían enseñarse en distintos foros, incluyendo uno de Pura Verpré que habla de la literatura de los niños acá en Nueva York en la época de los 40 hasta los 60, digamos, la historia de ella. Y además de eso, esperamos promover el libro de Gilberto Jerez Valentín, Las Memorias, que salen ahora en español, para allá, para el mes de enero y febrero. Así que todas estas colaboraciones con Puerto Rico son bien importantes para nosotros. Y si alguno de ustedes en la audiencia tienen interés en reunirse conmigo, mi dirección postal electrónica y teléfono están en el web. Edwin Meléndez, director del centro, contáctenme y yo los veo la próxima semana y hablamos de la exhibición que quieran llevar, de los materiales didácticos que hemos creado, incluyendo esta serie de los pósters.
De hecho, en estos momentos pues te puedo informar que sí nos interesa tener una reunión contigo. El grupo que está aquí, quizás otras personas más que en este momento no se encuentran, es cuestión de si va a estar en Río Piedra, pues sí, informarnos qué día.
Tengo disponible el viernes 14 o el lunes 17, cualquier hora. Envíame un email a Maker.
Antes de seguir, a mí me interesaría muchísimo, Amílcar, saber quiénes son las personas que están con ustedes. Y también en New York Tech y bueno, los colegas de Lehman también. ¿Se puede hacer una introducción bien rápida para saber?
Iris Rodríguez Parrilla, de Artes.
Doris Rivera Marrero, de la Biblioteca de Música.
Nancy Abreu, de la colección puertorriqueña.
Mayra Torres Álamo, de la Biblioteca Digital Puertorriqueña.
Dina Monjor, de la colección puertorriqueña.
Aura Díaz, de la colección Josefina del Toro, o libros raros y manuscritos.
Gracias. New York Tech, ¿quiénes están ahí?
En la Padilla, el asistente de Iván Barreras, el señor Martin Barr,
que es director del programa STEP, Ciencia, Tecnología, programa para estudiantes que están en escuela mediana. Yo me llamo Ivonne Barreras, directora del programa Collaborative, y tenemos el asistente que está aquí con la tecnología para ayudarnos.
Okay, gracias. Bien, en Lehman hay una persona nueva.
We're a mixed group, mostly from Latin American, Latino, and Puerto Rican studies with some other guests. Can we ask a question, though? We wanted to, Javier wanted to.
Can you?
Yes. Adelante.
Saludos a todos. I have a question, and it's in a way related to David's question. In terms of auxiliary material that is being produced so that one can use with the posters, like the videos or bibliographies or study guides. And the second question, while the posters are great and they're beautiful, so son muy bonitos, and have a lot of information, in the 21st century classroom, it's a bit unwieldy to bring them in. And for many of us who teach fully online, we can use them. Is there any effort, any plans to make this material available over the net or some kind of electronic form?
I think the answer is yes, and yes. to all your questions.
Javier, an example is on the chronology poster 3 and 4, today's posters, that there is a timeline down the middle, for example, on the education from the 60s up until middle 1995. That timeline with the events and the characters, individuals on the poster will be linked to a database, and people will be able to access the database, the timeline, and when they click, and this is the planning stage, if they see the Council of Spanish-Speaking Organizations, they will be able to access information about the Council of Spanish-Speaking Organizations. One student might be interested in the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater, and so another image is of Miriam Colon. I'm sorry, I'm not able to move it. But the point is that all of this information will be embedded online through links, so that the poster itself comes alive electronically, and students would be able to access whether it's the New Rican Poets Cafe or any of the other events on the poster number 3, more information if they wanted to do individual projects and further study.
Okay.
And I also would like to add that in addition, aside from what Luis has mentioned, and there will be also links to the Central Archives and many of the finding aids and other resources that are in the archives and in the library, and just want to add to what Amilcar was saying. Unfortunately, we do not have the Celia Vice papers in Centro. I don't know if they still exist or still there, but her presence, it is through the interviews precisely that Amilcar did for the Oral History Task Force. So we have in Centro oral history collections, the many interviews that were done to Celia Vice, and also her presence had been captured in the many photographs that we have throughout the collection, the Justo Amartí and the Migration Division, where she's very visible, and hopefully this conversation between Edwin and Mirka and many other people who are here may be lead to the finding her papers or whatever is out there that still could be recovered for future generations.
Let's just get the two people from Lehman who didn't introduce themselves. Can we do that?
Hi, I'm Alicia Galvez. I teach in the Latin American and Latino Puerto Rican Studies Department.
Okay.
Hi, Alicia.
And
Hi, Luis.
I'm Janice Massa. I teach in the Department of English. Please permit me to take a moment to express my gratitude to Luis Reyes for the lifeline that he provides to us in educational matters, and for all of you globally who have not subscribed to his list, please do, because it is absolutely invaluable.
yeah.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd also like to mention two of our faculty members who were here earlier but had to leave, Andy Torres and Teresita Levy.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's move on to the last poster for today, which is, Luis gave a wonderful segue into it, so we don't really have to go into much detail. But the educational struggles from the 1960s to 2010, and institution building and new traditions. And we have a video for that.
This poster is a brief historical chronology of Puerto Ricans in the United States, the Puerto Rican movement and its outcomes, the 1960s to the 2010s. In 1961, Dr. Antonia Pantoja, a Puerto Rican social worker and educator, established the organization Aspira in New York City, Institution Building and New Traditions, early 1960s. The first desfile puertorriqueño in New York took place in 1958, marking the beginning of the National Puerto Rican Day Parade tradition. The city of Philadelphia had been attracting Hispanic immigrants since the late 1800s. Significant increases in the Puerto Rican population occurred during and after World War II. In 1962, the Council of Spanish-Speaking Organizations, El Concilio, was founded to represent the community's socioeconomic and political concerns. The Concilio initiated the annual Puerto Rican Festival celebration in 1964, and the Puerto Rican Day Parade became the highlight of the festival. El Teatro Rodante Puertorriqueño, the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater, was created in 1967 by Puerto Rican actress Miriam Colon. The Museo del Barrio was founded in East Harlem, El Barrio, in 1969 by Puerto Rican activists. Taller Boricua, Puerto Rican Art Workshop, was established in New York in 1971 to promote the arts within the community. The New Yorican Poets Cafe was founded in New York in 1973 by poets Miguel Algarín, Pedro Pietri, and others to provide a community space for creative expression and performance.
Always on time. They were never late. They never spoke back when they were insulted. They worked. They never went on strike without permission. They never took days off that were not on the calendar. They worked 10 days a week and were only paid for 5. They worked, they worked, they worked and they died. They died broke.
In 1972, a group of Puerto Rican lawyers created the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. Pearl-Def represented Aspida in the legal case that produced the Aspida Consent Decree in 1974. The Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños was established at CUNY in 1973.
El centro se constituyó con el esfuerzo de profesores, estudiantes y de personas de todas las comunidades puertorriqueñas de esta ciudad y también de la isla.
Frank Bonilla would come on campus and he was working with us in terms of defining the program that we wanted, which we never got from the university, that is, we never got from Columbia University, but then City University established, funded funds from the Ford Foundation, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. So a lot of the thinking that went into defining, what the agenda for the Center for Puerto Rican Studies was going to be came out of, again, many sources, but one of them was what we had been doing at Columbia.
This brief historical chronology of Puerto Ricans in the United States has focused on two critical aspects: educational struggles and institution building. From the founding of Aspida in New York City in 1961, Puerto Rican parents, educators, and community activists have fought for quality education, bilingual instruction, and public schools that reflect their demands. From New York City and Philadelphia to cities in Central Florida, Puerto Ricans have developed educational, cultural, and legal institutions that celebrate their traditions and meet the needs of their evolving community.
Vamos primero a preguntas de los compañeros de Lehman College. David, preguntas, comentarios, sugerencias.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for introducing this new technology where it gives us a lot of ideas, and there's always something to think about and to keep developing it. So this is really helpful. I was just observing the aspect of the legal system and that sort of thing, and it seems that you introduce a lot of areas which aren't sufficiently researched. So my only observation, and it's actually an encouragement, is that this allows people to, or the instructors, to point out areas like Pearl-Def that need much more investigation. So it seems like a good starting point, as well as the more familiar things, or even Antonio Pantoja maybe people haven't read the book or the biography, the memoir. So it allows the instructor a lot of opportunities to direct the curriculum.
I think, David, it's also, this last video gives you a good feel for what could be done with online teaching, because there are so many resources that you can bring in like that. And all of that is available for online teaching, so that I think that the posters will lend themselves well to that venue as well. Okay.
If I can add a point from the last video, and that had to do with the issue of women. What we see in the video is that there are important women involved. Evelina Antonetti with United Bronx Parents, Miriam Colon, Teatro Rodante, Antonia Pantoja in the founding of Aspira in 1961, and the work in the founding Universidad Boricua, which preceded Boricua College.
Virginia Sanchez Corral.
Virginia Sanchez Corral in her work. So yes, there is a strand there. We have developed 4 teaching guides. In the audience with us here at Hunter today is Professor Carmen Mercado, a colleague, Professor Victoria Nunez, worked on teaching guides on Pura Belpré, Frank Bonilla, Jesus Colon, and Clemente Soto Vélez. And so 3 of those are connected to documentaries that have been completed in the last few years by Centro. And so the teaching guides, the posters, as well as the videos, documentaries, are what can be used in the classroom together. And we hope to create a DVD of the 2 video conferences on the posters, so that the presentation of the clips that you've seen, as well as our conversation Q&A, will be also resources for teachers. And one last thing I want to point to is at the very bottom of the poster, on the bottom right, is a QR code, so that somebody is able to access, if they with a device, a mobile device, that they're able to access the material. How are we doing there? Somebody else might explain the QR code.
And this is the link to the collections.
And the links to the collections of the material that are described in the posters are all contained at the very bottom of the poster, very much like a footnotes.
Ahora vamos a preguntas o comentarios o sugerencias de los compañeros de la Universidad de Puerto Rico. ¿Preguntas?
I mean, you can't hear him. Did we lose audio?
Yeah, because that's not like
Yeah.
So let's move to the next.
Vamos entonces a
New York
los
Tech.
compañeros del City Tech College. Comments, suggestions, anything you would like to add?
So, looking at, first of all, this is fabulous. I think it's very, very important, very necessary. We actually partner with middle schools and high schools, as I mentioned before, and I believe, as I'm sure most of you do, that there's a need for our younger children and young adults to have a better understanding of their culture. I'm just wondering what efforts are being made in order to create curriculum that could be provided to teachers to help them create lesson plans around this. Maybe through the social studies department or other.
You know, that's always been the problem. That's always been the big obstacle, right? That you've got the great material, you're excited about it, but now how do you translate that into standards, to meet standards, and to work with on a daily basis at the different levels. And we do have the courseware that's on the website. that is the first attempt at doing this. But I think we are also going to be developing a number of teacher materials. For example, there will be a teacher manual that is currently being developed to go along with the posters, so that will soon be available online. I think that's sort of, that project should be coming in pretty soon. And Edna Costa-Belén is doing it with some of the people from Albany. So that is something to look forward to, because that is the obstacle. And then the next thing is, well, how do you have teacher institutes that you can actually gather together this richness of ideas and interchange? And that's something that perhaps would be a collaborative venture. I'm sure that Luis has some ideas on his end about how that's going to be accomplished.
The teaching guides that I mentioned earlier that were prepared are in fact connected to standards, and they have activities, questions and answers, discussion questions, and bibliographic information, as well as introductory historical essays or biographical essays on the 4 Puerto Ricans that I mentioned. And so those were developed precisely to be used with middle school and high school students by teachers. But I think one of the suggestions is that there need to be opportunities for teachers, maybe in an institute or at a conference, for example, the State Association of Bilingual Ed Conference, or other professional development opportunities for teachers to be introduced to the poster series as well as to the documentaries by seeing some clips, and then being able to discuss how the materials can be used in the classroom. We lastly are going to be reaching out in January to the Office of English Language Learners to ask for their assistance in how the materials can be better meet the needs of teachers.
Yeah, one of the things that I may be wrong, Yvonne, but is there more of a trend towards teachers developing their own course outlines and materials in the classroom? Because I hear that some schools are doing that. And one of the nice things I think about the posters is that they give you the information all at once, and you can then pick and choose how you're going to develop your lesson plans and your lectures to go along with it. We have a spectrum of teaching where we are going from online teaching, as David Vadillo was saying before, to teaching in the middle schools and the high schools. Information that has previously not found its way into the curriculum, but given the political tenets of this nation at this point, I think that we're on the cusp of something that's very important.
We're going to take a comment of Central Director.
I may add that in addition to the forthcoming work on the posters that will be posted on the internet, we currently have, and in one of our prior video conferences, we introduced some educational support for the classroom products that we have in our website. For example, Carmen Mercado and Vicky Núñez produced some guides, teaching guides for important writers such as Antonia Pantojas, Jesus Colon, and others. We also have 2 online open courseware. One course by Vanessa Perez, Professor Perez, recorded and produced support materials for a course on how to teach Puerto Rican culture and heritage in your city. And then, of course, we have Virginia Sanchez-Corral course on the history of Puerto Ricans in the U.S., in which these posters are, have as a foundation. That is a 7 chapters book that we put on the internet, and adding as we speak links to the collections. It already contains some photos that will link you to some other materials. So we already have, and you can go to our website and look for the prior conferences and get an introduction to these resources. But there is more to come, and the message is we're going to produce rich materials to disseminate, to market this, pay attention to our blast every week as we introduce these new tools for teaching and learning Puerto Rican studies.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there any other comment or question from
Pedro,
Sí, a mí
Pedro Juan Río Piedras.
Adelante.
Sí, aquí hay una pregunta y un comentario.
La pregunta que yo tengo es la siguiente. Estos materiales se han preparado con la intención, entiendo yo, de que lleguen al sistema educativo público de la ciudad de Nueva York. ¿Cuál es el reto que se han planteado, si alguno, con las escuelas privadas que tienen población latina, o las escuelas charter, que entiendo que no son parte del sistema público de Nueva York o tienen una autonomía distinta a lo que es el sistema público educativo en Nueva York? ¿Cómo se han planteado eso, si se lo han planteado? ¿Cómo llegar a estos a las escuelas católicas, ese tipo de...?
Esa pregunta se la vamos a dar al director.
The reality ¿Prefiere que hable en español? Bueno, la realidad es que no hay ningún sistema público hoy día que tenga la historia de los puertorriqueños en Estados Unidos en ninguna parte, ni en Nueva York, como parte del currículo. Nuestra estrategia ha sido crear estos productos, tratar de buscar expertos que pueden compaginar, alinear estos productos a los llamados objetivos de aprendizaje que tienen los maestros en las escuelas públicas y privadas, para que entonces ellos puedan usarlos como material suplementario al currículo que ellos le asignan los distritos para que enseñen. Es decir, que la estrategia nuestra realmente es una que va de abajo hacia arriba, ¿no? Que no viene de los distritos, sino que es directamente entrenando y proveyendo materiales a los maestros y a los profesores de los distintos departamentos de Puerto Rican Studies, para que ellos sean el vehículo para llegar a los jóvenes. Porque realmente los distritos no tienen materiales, ni asignan currículos, ni alinean eso a los objetivos de aprendizaje de los maestros. Así que la colaboración que tenemos con los sistemas de bibliotecas en Puerto Rico, con los departamentos de estudios puertorriqueños en los Estados Unidos, para nosotros es esencial para poder llevar estos materiales a los jóvenes. De otra forma, no creo que pudiéramos hacerlo.
Había otro comentario de Río Piedras.
Sí, el comentario es mío, es en relación de nuevo con Celia Vice. Ciertamente los archivos de Celia Vice, parte se perdieron, parte creo que lo tienen algunos familiares, porque resulta que cuando ella murió, ella vivía en el Viejo San Juan. Yo me enteré de que estaban disponiendo o sacando de su casa eso para botarlo. Le pedí a un primo mío que las guardara en caja, me lo llevé para en casa de mi mamá. Ahí estuvieron por un tiempo. Una de las hijas entonces vino a recogerlo. No tuve alternativa porque pues, pertenecían a su mamá, así que se las devolví. Después de eso, entiendo que ella se mudó a Connecticut. Pero más allá si ella los dejó en algún lugar o los donó, lo tiene en su casa, eso no lo sé. Sí sé que cuando entrevisté, porque Celia era mi vecina en el Viejo San Juan, ella estaba escribiendo una historia de los puertorriqueños en Brooklyn. Claro, estaba en era una especie de, very rough, todavía empezando, lo que tenía eran documentos, tenía recortes de periódicos, pero básicamente hacía una historia de los puertorriqueños en Brooklyn. Y además que Celia tenía un vertical file o un cabinet file donde ella tenía muchos documentos, porque a ella los puertorriqueños le dan los documentos para que se los guardaran. Muchos de las células de la Oficina de Inmigración, actas de nacimiento, etcétera, etcétera. Yo los tenía guardados en su casa. Y ella servía como una especie de banco para estos puertorriqueños que no tenían dónde dejar sus documentos y ella se los guardaba. No sé si eso también se quedó guardado porque nunca revisé las cajas que tenía en casa, sino yo las guardé porque entendí que era muy importante mantener eso, esa documentación, porque Celia tuvo un rol bien importante por muchos años en Nueva York.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Vamos a hablar de darle seguimiento a eso.
Precisamente lo que esperamos es que estas conferencias han sido un agente catalítico para propiciar toda una serie de conversaciones y de lograr trabajar colectivamente en explorar posibilidades de usar todos estos recursos que están en todas nuestras lugares donde estamos trabajando, Puerto Rico, Nueva York y otras partes de la nación norteamericana, y ver cómo ponemos juntos todos esos recursos. Queremos señalar que all the video clips for this video conference and the previous one is available online at www.youtube.com/user/centropr. Again, www.youtube.com/users/centropr. And before we will be asking you to fill out evaluation forms and return them to your site moderator, or complete the evaluation online if you are participating by live streaming. And before, I think Virginia was suggesting that we introduce some of the people that are here and at Hunter that we haven't identified them, so we will go quickly throughout the audience.
If we could do that very quickly, that would be wonderful. Let's take the back row first, where
Libby?
Jamila, la gente.
Hi, my name is Libby Locke. I'm with New York.
Okay.
I'm Patricia Silver. I'm a central researcher. Hi, I'm Yamila Sterling, publications there.
And who worked prodigiously on these posters.
Ricardo Gabriel, research assistant at Centro and PhD student.
Okay.
Frank Ferrer, invitado de la casa, estamos en Puerto Rico y aprendiendo mucho de la diáspora.
And the next row?
Who's the next one? Oh, Edwin Melendez from Central.
Carmen Mercado, Hunter College School of Education.
Yeah.
And Centro.
I'm Margarita Ramirez, and I'm the events assistant at Central.
Evelyn Collazo, Hunter College events coordinator.
Sarah Molinari, research assistant at Central.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Claricel Gonzalez, and I'm staff writer for Central.
I'm Jose Camacho, I'm the webmaster.
And you know us, and you know him.
And Richie?
And our experts are our media staff. Richie, and who's hiding? And Melissa Garay. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Yo creo que esto ha sido una conferencia muy formidable. We've got a lot of stimulating conversation, things that we look forward to. And y felicidades a todos.